In the early years of the 20th century, Australia was still shaping its identity as a newly federated nation, having only become the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901. While legally united, the people still largely viewed themselves as British subjects, loyal to the Crown and aligned with imperial traditions. The vast distances between colonies, now states, and the ruggedness of the landscape had already begun forging a distinct national character defined by resilience, independence, and mateship. But it was a character still in search of a defining moment that would set Australia apart from its colonial parent and etch a unique identity into the consciousness of its people. That moment came in 1914. When the world plunged into a global conflict that would later be called the Great War when Britain declared war on Germany. Australia, as part of the British Empire, was automatically drawn into the conflict, but what followed was not merely an obligation. It was a surge of national enthusiasm, a patriotic fever that saw young men from every corner of the country volunteer in droves, eager to prove themselves to their peers and to the world. Many believed the war would be over by Christmas. They expected a grand adventure, a chance to see the world and earn glory in battle. Among them were farmhands, factory workers, miners, clerks, and students, all united by a common desire to serve and to belong, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. Soon to be known by the acronym ANZAC was formed, and their mission took them far from home to the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey. The goal of the campaign was to force a passage through the Dardanelles, capture Constantinople, and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. It was an ambitious strategy crafted by Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, and it would prove to be a deadly miscalculation. On April 25, 1915, the ANZACs landed at a narrow beach now known as ANZAC Cove under the cover of darkness and faced with towering cliffs, treacherous terrain, and well-fortified Turkish defenses. The landing was chaotic and met with intense resistance. Soldiers were cut down before they could reach the shore, and those who did scrambled to dig shallow trenches for cover. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, and the campaign soon turned into a brutal stalemate reminiscent of the Western Front. Instead of swift victory, the Anzacs found themselves entrenched. For months, enduring searing heat swarms of flies dysentery and the constant threat of sniper fire and artillery bombardments. Despite these overwhelming challenges, the Anzacs showed extraordinary courage and resilience. They dug in, they held the line, and they forged bonds that would become legendary stories of bravery circulated back home, like the account of Simpson and his donkey, a stretcher-bearer who ferried wounded men down the cliffs under constant fire for nearly a month before he was killed, or the tale of the silent truce on May 24th, when both sides agreed to a ceasefire to collect and bury the dead moments of shared humanity amid unimaginable horror. Australians followed the campaign with breathless devotion. Newspapers printed letters from the front, and communities held fundraising events and knitting circles to send supplies and comforts to the troops. When news of the disastrous outcome reached Australia, the public was devastated. Over 8,000 Australians had died, and many more were wounded. Yet the Gallipoli campaign became a defining chapter in the nation's story, not because of military success, but because of the valor, perseverance, and unity displayed under fire. These young men, who had left as colonials, returned as Australians. The shared suffering and sacrifice gave the young country a narrative of identity, forged not in parliament or by law, but in blood and brotherhood on a foreign shore. The traits embodied by the Anzacs, courage, endurance, ingenuity, and a profound sense of mateship, became hallmarks of what it meant to be Australian. The Gallipoli legend spread through poems, speeches, and songs, fueling a sense of national pride and collective memory that transcended the battlefield. In small towns and big cities, monuments were erected, and names were engraved into stone. Families mourned and remembered, and communities gathered to honor the fallen. In schools, children were taught the story of Gallipoli not as a tale of defeat, but as one of character and spirit. April 25th, the date of the landing, was officially designated ANZAC Day in 1916, and has since become a sacred day of national remembrance. Each year, at dawn, Australians gather In silence, as the last post is played and the first light breaks across the sky, honoring not only those who died at Gallipoli, but all who served and sacrificed for the nation. The legacy of Gallipoli marked a turning point. It shifted Australia's identity away from its colonial roots and toward a vision of itself as a proud, resilient, and independent nation. Even though Australia remained within the British Empire, the sense of having earned a place on the world stage began to grow. The ANZAC spirit lived on not only in military tradition, but in the Australian ethos. It celebrated the ordinary person doing extraordinary things, not out of desire for glory, but out of loyalty to one another and a shared belief in something greater than self. It was a spirit that found expression in the rugged outback, the bustling cities, and the quiet corners of the nation. It was in the way Australians lent a hand in crisis, cracked a joke in the face of adversity, and stood shoulder to shoulder. When it mattered most, the Gallipoli campaign may have failed in military terms, but in shaping the soul of a nation, it succeeded beyond measure. Following the tragic and formative experience at Gallipoli, the ANZACs were redeployed to the Western Front in Europe, where the war had descended into a brutal and grinding conflict. Unlike anything the world had seen before, the scale of violence, the technological horrors of machine guns, poison gas, and relentless artillery fire transformed the battlefield into a nightmarish wasteland of mud wire and death. Australian divisions found themselves entrenched in the battlefields of France and Belgium, where names like Fromelles, Pozières, Bullecourt, Messines, and Passchendaele would become etched into the nation's collective memory. The Battle of Fromelles in July 1916 marked the bloodiest 24 hours in Australian military history, with over 5,000 casualties in a single night. Yet despite the unimaginable loss, the Australian soldiers persisted, displaying the same spirit of determination and comradeship that had defined them at Gallipoli at Pozières. They endured weeks of relentless shelling that reduced the landscape to craters and dust, but they held their ground, advancing inch by inch under the worst conditions imaginable. It was during these campaigns that the world began to take serious note of the Australians and their fighting style. They were lauded for their initiative, resourcefulness, and refusal to blindly follow orders that they believed would lead to unnecessary slaughter. Their larrikin spirit, their disdain for rigid hierarchy, and their ability to work together under pressure set them apart from their British counterparts. While official reports praised their effectiveness, their letters home told a different story, filled with longing, horror, and the psychological toll of war. Men wrote of friends lost, of endless mud and cold, of rats crawling over sleeping bodies, and of the strange moments of humor that kept them sane amid despair. The war was revealing not only their physical endurance but also their emotional fortitude. It became clear that the ANZAC spirit was more than just battlefield bravery. It was the unbreakable bond between mates who would risk their lives for each other. It was the ability to find dignity in suffering and the strength to endure. When all hope seemed lost back in Australia, the impact of the war was deeply felt. Entire communities were changed forever. Small towns lost most of their young men, and the scars ran deep for those who returned as well as those who never would. Women filled critical roles in their absence, working in factories, driving ambulances, and serving as nurses near the front lines. Their contributions began to shift societal views on gender and paved the way for future movements for equality. Meanwhile, the country grappled with the emotional and economic strain of the conflict. Many returning soldiers found it difficult to reintegrate, haunted by what they had seen and burdened by wounds, both visible and hidden. The government struggled to provide adequate support, and mental health services were virtually non-existent. Yet the memory of Gallipoli and the continued valor of the Australians on the Western Front gave the public a rallying point. Anzac Day ceremonies grew in size and significance, becoming not just an occasion to honor the dead, but a symbol of unity, resilience, and national pride. Australians had gone to war as part of the British Empire, but they were returning with a sense of having proven themselves as a people and as a nation. They had fought and died alongside soldiers from around the world, but their unique character had shone through and earned international respect, even as the war dragged on and disillusionment grew. The belief in the ANZAC ideals endured and evolved. It began to represent a broader vision of Australian identity, one that celebrated courage over conquest, loyalty over authority, and mateship over individualism. As Australia mourned its 60,000 dead and cared for the countless wounded, the legend of the ANZACs offered a way to make sense of the sacrifice. It provided meaning and a sense of purpose to a generation. Marked by loss, the war also planted the seeds of change in Australia's political and cultural life. Questions arose about the country's future, its relationship with Britain, and its responsibilities to its own people. The war had revealed inequalities and inspired demands for greater fairness and recognition for veterans, for women, and for workers. The ideals the ANZACs had fought for, justice, equality, freedom, began to shape domestic policy and public discourse. Their legacy was not confined to the battlefield but lived on in the nation's evolving sense of itself. It was during these years that the foundations of modern Australia were being laid not just in infrastructure or legislation, but in the values held by its people. The ANZAC spirit had become a moral compass, a standard by which to judge both leaders and citizens, and it was teaching Australia that greatness was not inherited through empire or privilege, but earned through struggle, sacrifice, and solidarity. As the guns fell silent on November 11, 1918, and the world began to count the cost of the war, Australia stood not only among the victors, but among the transformed. It had lost a generation, but found a soul, and in doing so took its first true steps toward becoming a nation in its own right. The years following the end of World War I were filled with both celebration and struggle, as Australians welcomed home their soldiers with parades, cheers, and gratitude. Yet beneath the surface lay a quiet storm of trauma, grief, and transition. The men who returned were not the same boys who had left for the front. They came back bearing physical injuries, shattered nerves, and haunted memories. Many found it difficult to find work or reconnect with a society that had moved on without them. While the nation had united in pride and sorrow, the government was ill-prepared to meet the needs of tens of thousands of veterans returning to a fragile economy and limited support systems. Homes for soldiers were promised, but in short supply. Medical care was basic at best, and mental health barely understood. The soldiers who had once been hailed as heroes now found themselves navigating a world that often forgot their sacrifice in this environment. The ANZAC spirit became more than a battlefield legacy. It became a code for living, one that many veterans carried with them into civilian life. It encouraged stoicism in suffering, camaraderie in hardship, and the determination to keep going, no matter the odds. Veterans formed support networks and returned to their communities as quiet symbols of resilience. Their example inspired those around them, and over time, the values they embodied began to influence national identity in broader and deeper ways. The figure of the digger became an iconic image, a sunburned, tough, humble man who asked for little, gave everything, and never abandoned a mate. This archetype began to appear in literature, theater, and emerging films. It was celebrated in school, textbooks, speeches, and civic rituals, and became an enduring reference point in Australia's public consciousness. Alongside this cultural embedding came an intellectual shaping. Historians, journalists, and war correspondents like C.E.W. Bean, who had accompanied the ANZACs during the war, played a pivotal role in crafting and spreading the mythology. Bean's writings, and his role in founding the Australian War Memorial, ensured that the story of the ANZACs would not be lost to time, but rather preserved as a foundational narrative for the young nation. He argued that the qualities shown by the ANZACs were not just military virtues, but reflections of Australian society at its best. Egalitarianism, larrikin humor, mateship, and quiet strength were not accidental traits, but essential ingredients of what it meant to be Australian, and thus the war experience became the moral bedrock of the nation. It offered a standard to which future generations could aspire, and a set of values to measure both public policy and private behavior. ANZAC Day became more than a memorial. It became a cultural mirror reflecting not only the past, but the aspirations of the present and the future. Schools began teaching the ANZAC story not just as history, but as civics reinforcing ideals of service, humility, and courage. Students were encouraged to visit memorials, participate in dawn services, and reflect on the meaning of sacrifice for many young Australians. The image of the digger became a point of pride, a reminder that greatness could emerge from ordinary people under extraordinary circumstances over time. However, the idealization of the ANZAC experience came under scrutiny, particularly as Australia evolved. Socially and demographically, Indigenous Australians who had fought alongside white soldiers were rarely acknowledged in official histories, and upon returning from war were denied the same rights and honors extended to others' women's roles in the war. While critical, were often sidelined in commemorative practices and national narratives, and pacifists or conscientious objectors were largely ignored or dismissed. Yet despite these blind spots, the ANZAC spirit continued to endure, not because it was perfect, but because it was adaptable. Its core values could be reinterpreted to include new voices and experiences, and in doing so, it remained relevant as Australia moved into the interwar years, the Great Depression, and later the Second World War. The lessons of Gallipoli and the Western Front continued to echo through public life and political rhetoric. They shaped attitudes toward leadership, policy, and social cohesion, and helped define how Australians responded to adversity. During the economic collapse of the 1930s, when unemployment soared and despair took hold, the idea of sticking together and looking out for one another, often framed through the lens of the ANZAC experience, helped sustain communities and inspired acts of solidarity and resilience when Australia once again found itself at war. In 1939, the sons of the ANZACs marched in their fathers' footsteps, carrying not only rifles, but also the legacy of character and courage that had become a national inheritance. The memory of the First War did not glorify conflict, but it provided a model for how Australians could meet the challenges ahead with unity, determination, and a refusal to give in. In this way, the ANZAC spirit had evolved from a military tradition into a broader civic creed. It informed how Australians saw themselves and their place in the world not as a colonial outpost or a distant dominion, but as a nation capable of its own judgment, strength, and compassion. It was a story rooted in sorrow but rich in meaning, and it helped turn a once scattered federation into a cohesive community bound not just by borders, but by values and shared history. The legacy of World War I and the mythos of the ANZACs were now interwoven with the fabric of Australian identity, not merely as a reminder of what had been lost, but as a compass for what the country could become. As Australia moved through the mid-20th century, the ANZAC spirit remained a powerful force in shaping how the nation understood itself and its place in an increasingly complex world. With the outbreak of World War II in 1939, the legacy of World War I loomed large over the national psyche. This time, it was not just about proving worth on the battlefield, but about defending the hard-earned identity and values forged a generation earlier. The soldiers who enlisted carried the stories of Gallipoli and the Western Front in their hearts. Often, as told by fathers, uncles, and neighbors, the digger tradition lived on, not just in the trenches of Tobruk or the jungles of New Guinea, but in the moral code, the belief in mateship, sacrifice, and courage that defined how Australians fought and how they endured the horrors of a new and even more devastating war in the years that followed. Australia continued to send troops to conflicts across the globe, including Korea, Vietnam, and peacekeeping missions in East Timor, the Middle East, and the Pacific. Each time the ANZAC spirit was invoked by leaders, by soldiers, and by the public as a reminder of the values that should guide action in times of crisis. As Australia's social fabric began to change through immigration, cultural shifts, and growing independence from Britain, the ANZAC legend served both as a unifier and a challenge. It reminded new citizens of the ideals upon which modern Australia was built and urged them to contribute to a society shaped by shared responsibility, courage and fairness. At the same time, it forced reflection on who had been left out of that original narrative: Indigenous. Australians whose service in World War I was overlooked and whose communities suffered ongoing discrimination began to be acknowledged for their contributions and sacrifices. Women who had historically been cast in supporting roles were increasingly recognized as essential agents of strength and resilience, both on the front lines and at home in hospitals, factories, and households. The broadening of the ANZAC legend allowed for a richer and more inclusive national story, one that better reflected the diversity and complexity of Australia itself. ANZAC Day ceremonies evolved from being primarily military commemorations to deeply civic rituals, where Australians from all walks of life gathered in silence at dawn to remember those who had served and died, and to renew a collective commitment to the values they represented from large cities to remote towns. The same pattern repeated every April 25th. People, young and old, immigrants and descendants of diggers, schoolchildren, and veterans gathered not to glorify war, but to honor character. Australians began to understand the ANZAC spirit not as belonging to the past, but as a living tradition that continued to inspire courage and compassion. In the present, it was invoked, not only in times of military service, but also during natural disasters, economic hardship, and public emergencies. When floods swept through Queensland or bushfires ravaged Victoria, Australians rallied together, citing the ANZAC values of mateship and mutual support. Frontline workers, from firefighters to nurses, were praised as modern diggers, standing firm in the face of danger and putting others before themselves. In this way, the legacy of World War I continued to evolve, touching lives. Far removed from battlefields and becoming a cultural touchstone for national behavior and identity. Political leaders often referenced the ANZAC spirit during national addresses, appealing to a sense of unity and resilience drawn from the shared sacrifices of the past. Yet the use of this legacy was not without criticism. Some questioned whether the mythos had been overly romanticized, used to justify foreign wars, or overshadowed other important narratives, such as those of peace protest or reconciliation. Despite these critiques, the core of the ANZAC legacy remained remarkably durable because it was rooted in human qualities that transcended context: courage, loyalty, humility, and the willingness to endure hardship for the good of others were not confined to the battlefield nor limited to soldiers. They were values that could be practiced by anyone in any situation, and thus the ANZAC spirit remained relevant even as the nature of war changed, and as Australia's population became more globalized and its role in the world more multifaceted. Education continued to play a vital role in preserving and adapting the legacy. Schools took students to war. Memorials had veterans speak in assemblies and organized ANZAC essay competitions and history projects beyond the textbooks. Students were encouraged to engage with real stories, letters, photographs, and oral histories, helping them see the diggers not as distant heroes, but as ordinary people thrust into extraordinary situations. The more personal and nuanced understanding of the war and its aftermath helped deepen national empathy and broaden the definition of what it meant to be Australian. The image of the digger was no longer confined to a uniform or a particular gender, race, or background. It became a symbol of shared values carried by anyone willing to act with courage and compassion in the face of adversity. Over time, the ANZAC legacy was even used to promote social causes, campaigns against bullying, support for mental health, and programs for youth empowerment. All drew inspiration from the ideals first witnessed in the trenches of Gallipoli and the mud of the Somme. In this way, the ANZAC spirit helped shape not only how Australians remembered the past, but how they envisioned the future. It offered a template for national character, one that prized unity without uniformity, strength without arrogance, and sacrifice without expectation of reward. As Australia continued to evolve economically, socially, and politically, the memory of World War I remained a grounding force, a reminder of where the nation had been and what it had learned through loss and resilience. The story of the ANZACs was no longer just a story about war. It was a story about a people and the kind of nation they aspired to be. More than a century after the first ANZACs stormed the shores of Gallipoli, the spirit they forged continues to shape the soul of modern Australia. It lives in the solemnity of dawn services, the reverence of national memorials, and the quiet acts of service performed daily by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. It is a spirit that transcends generations, reminding Australians of their shared values and their capacity for resilience in the face of hardship. The ANZAC legacy is not one of glorifying conflict but of honoring character. It teaches that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to stand firm in spite of it. That mateship is not just about friendship, but about standing by others no matter the cost, and that sacrifice means putting the well-being of others before one's own comfort or safety. These lessons remain vital as the nation continues to face new challenges, from global pandemics to environmental disasters and economic uncertainty. In each of these trials, Australians have looked inward to that legacy, finding strength in unity and purpose in compassion when bushfires devastated entire communities. Volunteers rushed to help strangers when floods displaced families. Neighbors shared their homes and resources. When a health crisis swept the country front line, workers were hailed as modern-day heroes, echoing the bravery and commitment of those first ANZACs. In every case, the values that emerged from the trenches of World War I remained steadfast in public consciousness, guiding both individual and collective action, even among those who have never worn a uniform or attended a march. The ANZAC spirit influences how people engage with one another with humility, respect, and a willingness to do their part. This evolving legacy ensures that the memory of those who served is not frozen in history, but alive in everyday deeds. The image of the digger has grown from a symbol of wartime endurance to a broader emblem of national integrity. It represents a country that prizes fairness over privilege, solidarity over selfishness, and service over entitlement as Australia becomes increasingly diverse. This shared story becomes even more important, offering a unifying thread through the richness of cultures, backgrounds, and beliefs. It invites every citizen, new or old, to carry forward the values that shaped the nation in its darkest hours, not as a burden, but as a badge of collective identity. As the sun rises each ANZAC day, and the last post sounds across quiet fields and bustling cities alike, Australians are reminded of who they are and how far they have come. The ANZAC spirit born in fire, nurtured in remembrance, and renewed through each generation, remains the heartbeat of a nation that continues to find its strength in the stories of its people.